Tropical storm. Bertha officially formed in the Gulf yesterday, about 100 miles from the Florida Panhandle, and alerts are now in effect across 4 states as the storm makes its presence felt. You can see the track here. Our Lana Zach is in the middle of it, on Pensacola Beach, Florida, where people are preparing for intense weather. Lana, you've been talking with folks in the region. How are they preparing? We're doing okay out here so far. What we're really feeling right now is the wind picking up. A lot of the beaches have already been closed, and officials are focused on flooding, both from the rainfall itself and from Gulf water pushing inland. The outer bands of Tropical Storm Bertha are already lashing parts of Florida with intense thunderstorms, and rain isn't the only flooding concern. One of the bigger worries for places like Pensacola is storm surge. Bertha could push a 2 to 4 foot wall of water inland from the coast. You can see barricades going up right here. How often do people try to drive around them? More often than you'd think. The problem with a spot like this is that the water is always deeper than it looks, and it can stall out a car very quickly. Let's back up and give viewers the full picture of how we got here, because this storm has moved fast. Bertha's story actually begins several days ago as an unassuming disturbance in the northeastern Gulf. The National Hurricane Center first flagged the system as Tropicus, followed Depression 2 on the morning of July 19th, when it was centered south of Panama City, Florida. It stayed disorganized for a day, fighting against wind shear that kept its thunderstorms lopsided, and its center hard to pin down on satellite imagery. Then, on the evening of July the 20th, a Hurricane Hunter aircraft flew directly into the system and measured sustained winds of 40 miles per hour, enough to officially upgrade it to Tropical Storm Bertha, the second named storm of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season. He's to close and double red flags to go up, signaling that the water itself was off limits to swimmers. The storm's forward motion was sluggish for much of this stretch, crawling west-northwest at only about 6 miles per hour at one point, which meant that rather than blowing through quickly, it lingered over the same stretch of coastline for an extended period, prolonging the rain, the wind, and the rough surf. That slow movement is actually one of the more consequential details of this storm, meteorologically speaking, because a slow-moving tropical system, even a comparatively weak one like Bertha, tends to dump far more rain on any one location than a fast-moving storm of the same intensity would. Forecasters projected widespread rainfall totals of 1 to 4 inches across the central and western Gulf Coast, with isolated pockets seeing up to 6 inches, enough to trigger localized flash flooding, particularly in urban areas with poor drainage. By Tuesday, the National Hurricane Center had extended tropical storm warnings from the Bay Gulf County line in Florida all the way west to the Terrebonne-Lafourche line in Louisiana, covering essentially the entire northern Gulf Coast in the storm's path. A storm surge watch was posted at one point for life-threatening flooding, though it was later downgraded to a coastal flood warning for southeastern Louisiana and the Mississippi coast, reflecting forecasters' growing confidence that the surge threat, while real, was shifting from a sudden, dangerous push of water to a more gradual rise, still capable of producing up to 4 feet of water in low-lying coastal spots, but with less of the sudden, life-threatening surge that the earlier watch had been designed to warn against. Bertha made its first landfall in the United States just after 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, July 22nd, coming ashore in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, near the Biloxi Wildlife Management Area, with maximum sustained wind, of 45 miles per hour at the moment of landfall. Louisiana's governor, Jeff Landry, said the state had distributed 30,000 sandbags across Orleans Parish ahead of the storm, and that more than 90% of the area's major drainage pumps were operational and ready, precautions aimed squarely at preventing the kind of urban street flooding that slow-moving Gulf storms are especially prone to causing in low-lying cities like New Orleans. After that first landfall, Bertha didn't simply dissipate the way many people might expect a weakening tropical storm to. Instead, battered by wind shear, its center of circulation actually began to blur on satellite imagery, hugging the Louisiana coastline through Thursday as forecasters watched for the possibility that a new center of circulation might reform closer to the cluster of thunderstorms that had shifted mainly out over open water. That messy, drawn-out structure meant Bertha continued producing tropical storm force conditions along the coast, even as its exact center became difficult to track precisely, and it kept moving slowly west-northwest through Thursday, staying just offshore before its forward speed picked up to more than 10 miles per hour later in the day. Bertha then made a second official U.S. landfall on Thursday afternoon, July 23rd, this time near the Texas-Louisiana border, becoming just the second storm this season to both form and make landfall along the Gulf Coast. By that point, sustained winds had dropped to 45 miles per hour, and they continued weakening through the evening, falling to around 35 miles per hour as the storm pushed inland toward the upper Texas coast. Forecasters expected another 1 to 3 inches of rain, with isolated totals up to 4 inches, across the Texas Gulf Coast and South Texas, warning that this additional rain could still produce isolated flash flooding, especially in urban areas already saturating. Ed, from days of steady rainfall. By Thursday night, Bertha had weakened to a tropical depression, and meteorologists were tracking the possibility that it would degenerate into a mere trough of low pressure sometime in the following day or two, effectively marking the end of Bertha as an organized tropical system. It's worth noting that Bertha wasn't operating in a geographic vacuum. This same stretch of the Gulf Coast, particularly coastal Mississippi, was still recovering from an earlier storm this season, Tropical Storm Arthur, the first-named storm of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, which made landfall in southern Louisiana back on June 17th. Arthur brought genuinely historic rainfall, with totals reaching an estimated 29.6 inches near Cottonport, Louisiana, over 24 hours, a total that may have set a new all-time record for the state. That means some of the same communities bracing for Bertha's rain this week were doing so on top of Ground A, already saturated and infrastructure already strained from Arthur's flooding just over a month earlier. A detail that matters because saturated soil and already full drainage systems can turn what would otherwise be a moderate rainfall event into a more serious flooding threat. Back here on the Florida Panhandle, the normally busy beaches are largely empty. Christy Newkirk works at Key Sailing, a boat rental shop nearby. The tourists are watching the news. They see we're about to get hit by a tropical storm, so they're leaving. Around the rest of the country, wild weather caused problems. Monday from the east coast to the southwest, entirely unrelated to Bertha, but a reminder that this has been an active stretch of severe weather nationally. Time-lapse video showed severe storms hitting Des Moines, Iowa, flooding streets after more than 3 inches of rain fell in a short span, overwhelming storm drains. In parts of the city, faster than crews could respond. In Arizona, heavy monsoon rain caused flooding about 80 miles north of Phoenix, with the force EA of the water strong enough to move shipping containers and sweep a car off the road, a stark illustration of just how much force fast-moving floodwater can carry, even far from any tropical system, driven instead by the Southwest's seasonal summer monsoon pattern rather than anything connected to the Gulf. It's worth taking a moment to explain why storm surge specifically gets so much attention from forecasters and emergency officials, even for a storm that never reaches hurricane strength. Storm surge is the abnormal rise of water generated by a storm's winds pushing water toward the shore, and it's historically been one of the deadliest components of any tropical system, often more dangerous than the wind itself. A surge of just 2 to 4 feet, the range forecasters were watching for with Bertha, might not sound severe compared to the double-digit surge heights associated with major hurricanes, but it's more than enough to flood roads, strand vehicles, and turn familiar streets into fast-moving water hazards, particularly when it combines with high tide, heavy rainfall, or both at once, which is part of why officials from the mouth of the Mississippi River to the Alabama border were tracking the timing of surge arrival against the tide cycle so closely throughout this event. That's also the reasoning behind the barricades going up on flooded roadways, and why officials get frustrated watching people try to drive around them. Water across a roadway during a storm surge or flash flood event is almost never a reliable depth to judge by eye, since it obscures curbs, drop-offs, and washed-out pavement underneath. It takes a relatively small amount of moving water, generally sit, head by federal safety officials, as somewhere around a foot or two of fast-moving water, to float a typical passenger vehicle and sweep it off the roadway entirely, which is exactly the mechanism behind the vehicle swept off the road in Arizona's monsoon flooding this same week, even though that specific incident had nothing to do with Bertha. For residents across the warned areas, from the Florida Panhandle through Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and eventually into Texas as Bertha's track shifted west, the practical guidance from emergency officials has been consistent throughout this storm. Avoid driving through any flooded roadway regardless of how shy. Low, it appears. Stay out of the water at beaches where red flags or double red flags are flying, since rip currents and rough surf remain dangerous even well outside the storm's most intense bands, and continue monitoring updates from the National Hurricane Center and local emergency management officials as Bertha's exact track, and rainfall totals continue to shift day to day. As of the storm's second landfall and its weakening into a tropical depression, the overall picture for Bertha looks like a storm that, while never approaching hurricane intensity, still managed to produce a genuinely wide footprint of impacts: closed beaches and dangerous surf across the Florida Panhandle and Alabama coast, storm surge and coastal flu, ding concerns across southeastern Louisiana and the Mississippi coast, and a slow, grinding path across 2 separate landfalls that extended its rainfall and wind impacts across a longer stretch of coastline and a longer period of time than a faster-moving storm of the same peak intensity typically would. Coming just over a month after Arthur's record-setting rainfall in the same general region, Bertha is a reminder that a storm doesn't need to reach hurricane strength to create serious, sustained impacts for coastal communities already dealing with the cumulative effects of an active hurricane season. It's worth putting Bertha in a bit of historical context. since the name itself has come up before in recent memory. The last storm to carry the name Bertha, back in 2020, was a very different kind of system. A rapidly forming, short-lived storm that became a named tropical storm just an hour before making landfall near sea. Harleston, South Carolina, on May 27th of that year, after dumping torrential rain across South Florida while it was still just an unorganized disturbance. That 2020 version of Bertha brought rainfall totals of 6 to 8 inches to parts of southeastern Florida and the northern Bahamas, and even spawned a brief EF1 tornado near Aladdin City, Florida, before weakening quickly. Once it moved inland over the Carolinas. Names get reused in the Atlantic Basin on a 6-year rotation, retired only if a storm was especially deadly or destructive. So seeing Bertha appear again this season doesn't imply any connection to that earlier storm. Just that enough time has passed for the name to cycle back into use. The two storms otherwise have little in common beyond sharing a name and both threatening the southeastern U.S. coastline. This year's Atlantic hurricane season had already been active before Bertha ever formed. Tropical Storm Arthur, the season's first named storm, made landfall in southern Louisiana back on June 17th, and its rainfall totals were genuinely historic, with an estimated 29.06 inches recorded near Cottonport, Louisiana, over a 24-hour period, a total that may stand as a new all-time record for the state once officially confirmed. That means Bertha arrival, Ed, in a region still actively recovering from Arthur's flooding, with saturated soil, strained drainage infrastructure, and, in some communities, ongoing recovery work from the earlier storm. Emergency officials factor in exactly this kind of cumulative vulnerability when planning their response to a second storm arriving in quick succession, since a moderate amount of additional rainfall can produce disproportionately serious flooding when the ground and drainage systems have little remaining capacity left to absorb it. Let's talk a bit more about what actually makes storm surge such a persistent focus for forecasters, since it's a concept that can be easy to underestimate from the outside. Unlike the wind field of a tropical storm, which tends to be relatively well understood and predictable once a storm's intensity is known, storm surge depends heavily on the specific shape of the coastline, the depth of the water just offshore, the angle, i.e. at which a storm's wind field pushes water toward land, and the timing of that push relative to the normal rise and fall of the tide. That's why forecasters were tracking the specific window during which Bertha's peak surge might coincide with high tide along the Louisiana and Mississippi coastline, since a surge arriving at high tide can produce meaningfully higher water levels than the same surge arriving at low tide. For Bertha, forecasters ultimately projected water levels reaching 2 to 4 feet above ground from the mouth of the Mississippi River to the Alabama border if the timing lined up unfavorably, with a somewhat lower range, 1 to 3 feet, expected further west toward Cameron, Louisiana, and along the coast east of the Alabama-Florida line toward the Florida Panhandle. It's also worth understanding why officials in Louisiana specifically emphasized drainage pump readiness ahead of this storm, since it points to a particular vulnerability of low-lying Gulf Coast cities. New Orleans, and much of the surrounding region, sits at or below sea level in many neighborhoods, relying on an extensive system of pumps to actively remove rainwater and prevent street flooding during any significant rain event, tropical or otherwise. Governor Landry's office, highlighting that more than 90% of the region's major pumps were operational ahead of Bertha wasn't just a routine talking point, it reflected genuine, practical infrastructure. Replanning specific to a city where pump failures during a major rain event have historically led to serious urban flooding, independent of storm surge from the Gulf itself. Distributing 30,000 sandbags across Orleans Parish served a similar complementary purpose, giving residents and business owners a way to protect individual doorways and low points against street-level flooding, even where the pump system was working as intended. Turning back to the Florida Panhandle specifically, where our coverage began, it's worth noting how directly this storm affected the local tourism economy, which is the backbone of much of that coastline's summer business. Beach closures during peak summer season represent a real, if usually temporary, economic disruption. And for towns like Panama City Beach, Destin, and Pensacola, where hotels, restaurants, boat rental operators like Key Sailing and beachfront shops depend heavily on steady tourist traffic through the warmer months. Local officials have to balance that economic reality against the genuine safety risk posed by rip currents, rough surf, and lightning associated with the tropical system's outer bands, which is why double red flags, indicating the water is completely closed to swimmers, get posted even well before a storm's center arrives, and why local businesses like Key Sailing plan for a predictable dip in customers every time a named storm tracks anywhere near the northern Gulf. It's also useful to walk through exactly what residents across the warned area were being told to do while Bertha approached, since the guidance varied a bit by specific risk. For coastal residents in surge-prone, low-lying areas, especially in southeastern Louisiana and along the Mississippi coast, officials urged people to know their evacuation zone in advance and to Low any local evacuation orders promptly rather than waiting to see how the storm developed, since surge flooding can arrive with less warning than people often expect. For residents further inland, away from the immediate surge zone but still within the path of heavy rainfall, the primary guidance centered on flash flood safety, never driving through a flooded roadway regardless of how familiar the road normal. Lylooks, moving vehicles to higher ground ahead of expected heavy rain where possible, and having a communication plan in place in case of temporary power outages, which remain a common side effect of tropical storm force winds, even well away from a storm's exact center. For our beachgoers and coastal visitors specifically, the guidance was simpler and more immediate. Respect posted flag warnings, stay entirely out of the water when double red flags are flying, and be aware that dangerous rip currents can persist along the coastline for days after a storm has passed, even once the sky has cleared and the storm itself has moved on or weakened. There's also a broader seasonal context worth mentioning here. Bertha struck during what's typically a ramp-up period for Atlantic hurricane activity, with the season's statistical peak still weeks away in early to mid-September. Meteorologists watching the basin this year have been tracking a persistent pattern of wind shear across much of the Gulf and Westa. RN Atlantic, the same disruptive upper-level winds that kept Bertha lopsided and prevented it from strengthening beyond a moderate tropical storm despite favorably warm Gulf water temperatures underneath it. That combination, warm water capable of fueling a stronger storm, offset by shear tearing apart the storm's structure before it can fully organize, has been a recurring theme this season, and it's part of why forecasters were confident heading into this event that Bertha was unlikely to intensify into a hurricane, despite spending several days over some of the warmest water in the entire Gulf of Mexico. For anyone in the broader Gulf Coast region looking to stay informed as storms like Bertha develop through the rest of this hurricane season, the National Hurricane Center's public advisories remain the most authoritative, continuously updated source for track forecasts, watches, and warnings, typically updated every few hours during an active storm and supplemented by special updates whenever a storm's intensity or track shifts meaningfully between. In scheduled advisories, local emergency management offices in each affected parish and county also maintain their own specific guidance on evacuation zones, shelter locations, and local infrastructure status. Information that's often more immediately actionable for residents than the broader regional forecasts alone. It's worth spending a little more time on the flooding unfolding elsewhere in the country this same week, since it illustrates just how many different weather mechanisms can produce the same basic hazard, fast-moving water in places people don't expect it. The flooding in Des Moines wasn't tied to any tropical system at all. It came from a cluster of severe thunderstorms that dumped more than 3 inches of rain into her. A compressed window of time, more than the city's storm drains could handle at once, turning ordinary streets into fast-flowing channels within a matter of minutes. That kind of rapid urban flash flooding is a recurring risk for cities across the Midwest during summer when slow-moving or repeatedly redeveloping thunderstorm clusters can train over the same area for hours, dropping far more rain locally than the broader regional forecast might suggest. Arizona's flooding, roughly 80 miles north of Phoenix, came from an entirely different seasonal pattern. The Southwest's summer monsoon, a recurring shift in wind flow that brings moisture up from the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico into the desert, southwest, each summit. Fueling intense, localized thunderstorms over terrain that's often bone dry the rest of the year. Because much of that terrain is exactly the kind of hard-packed or rocky ground that doesn't absorb water quickly, monsoon rainfall tends to run off rapidly into washes and low-lying areas, producing flash floods capable of surprising force, even from storms that might not look especially dramatic on radar. The footage of shipping containers being moved and a car being swept off the road illustrates that force vividly. Floodwater, moving with enough speed and volume, can displace objects far heavier than most people instinctively expect, which is exactly why safety officials across flood-prone regions, whether from tropical storms on the Gulf Coast or monsoon storms in the desert Southwest, repeat the same core warning: never attempt to drive or walk through moving floodwater, regardless of how shallow or survivable it might look from a vehicle's window. Taken together, this week's weather across the country, Bertha grinding slowly along the northern Gulf Coast, thunderstorms, overwhelming drainage in Des Moines, and monsoon rains tearing through washes north of Phoenix reflects a broader pattern of an active, moisture-rich H-summer pattern, producing serious flooding risk through several entirely different meteorological mechanisms at once. None of these events were connected to one another physically, but they share the same underlying lesson for anyone watching from home. Flooding doesn't require a hurricane or even a named storm to become genuinely dangerous, and the specific safety guidance, staying out of moving water and never attempting to drive through a flooded roadway, applies just as strongly to a fast-developing thunderstorm in Iowa or a monsoon wash in Arizona as it does to storm surge along the Gulf Coast. As Bertha weakens into a tropical depression and eventually degrades into a simple trough of low pressure over the coming day or two, the practical story for most of the affected Gulf Coast region shifts from storm surge and coastal wind risk toward inland flash flooding, since the same slow-moving rain bands that soaked the coast can continue producing localized downpours well after the storm's center has come ashore and lost its tropical characteristics. That's part of why forecasters continued watching rainfall totals along the storm. His inland track through Texas, even after its sustained winds had dropped well below tropical storm strength. Since flash flooding doesn't require a named storm or hurricane-force winds to become genuinely dangerous, only enough rain falling faster than the ground and drainage systems beneath it can absorb. All right, batten down the hatches and stay safe out there, Lana. We'll continue to track Bertha's remnants as they move inland, and we'll keep you updated on rainfall totals and any lingering flood warnings as this system winds down over the coming day, along with any meaningful changes to the broader outlook as we head further deeper into what's shaping up to be a genuinely active Atlantic hurricane season overall.